Good afternoon. I'm going to let folks continue to trickle into our virtual space before we start our webinar. Thank you for being here today. Give it just a few more moments. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Stacia Stelk, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, The Lunch and Learn with Scott Woodbury, our Cultivars Too Much of a Good Thing. Before we get started, please note some of our upcoming online and upcoming online and in-person events. This month's Native Plants at Noon is on the road and will feature the church glades of Southwest Missouri. You can enjoy Native Plants at Noon every third Thursday of the month, and we have recordings available for your convenience. You can register and find those recordings at our website, deeproots.org. If you have stepped outside your door this week, I'm sure you've noticed Bradford, otherwise known as Callery pear trees, blooming everywhere. If you have one in your outdoor space, Deep Roots encourages you to cut it down, treat the stump, and sign up for a free native tree on our website. Finally, Deep Roots is hosting its annual spring plant sale on Earth Day, April 22nd. How convenient is that? Join us at the Metropolitan Community College's Longview campus from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturday, April 22nd. And finally, don't forget to ask questions using Zoom's question and answer Q&A feature and make comments with the chat feature. At the end of today's presentation, we will take a few moments to answer some of the most popular questions. And now I will welcome Scott to our virtual stage. Excellent. So for 30 years, Scott led the development of the Whitmire Wildflower Garden at the Shaw Nature Reserve and has written, lectured, and consulted on many native landscaping projects. Scott teaches native landscape practices at the St. Louis Community College, and he recently launched Cacalia Garden Design and Wilding, a consulting and design business in St. Louis. Scott received a Bachelor's of Science degree in horticulture, I knew I was going to stumble over some word, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has worked at various public gardens. He currently serves as an advisor to the horticulture program at the St. Louis Community College, Grow Native, and Wild Ones St. Louis, a chapter he founded in 2000 and is now the largest in the nation. Welcome, Scott, to the stage, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Stacia. It's great to be with you. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Dina, also for your backup support. This morning we needed it because my computer stopped working and then it started working again. So anyway, here I am, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about this important subject. It's a subject that I hear so much about. Lots of different opinions, lots of sometimes heated opinions, sometimes cool and calm opinions. I hope to bring you today a balanced presentation that really is more of a what are cultivars anyway, how do they function in the landscape, and I'm going to try to avoid making any judgment calls here. So why don't I just jump right in and share my screen, and we will get started. How about that? And just one more button I need to click here.
You're good to go. I will see you on the other side. Thanks, Scott.
All right. See you, Stacia. All right. I'll assume that that looks good on your end. Just give a holler if it doesn't.
It's perfect on my side.
Okay, great. Are nativars too much of a good thing? I don't know. Maybe you'll get an answer by the end of the presentation. I don't want to say that they're good or they're bad. I really would like to spend my time talking about what nativars are. And so what's the difference between a nativar and a cultivar? They're essentially the same thing. A nativar, though, is a cultivar of a native plant. And that's really the only difference. So if somebody is talking about a cultivar, then you'll know what a cultivar here is in a minute. If they're talking about a nativar, they're basically talking about a cultivar. All right, so I think it's a good idea to break down what a cultivar is into all of their elements. I mean, they're basically 4 different types of cultivars. That's basically, there's a lot of variation in some of these categories. And some of these types of cultivars are way more prevalent than others. And so I'll try to mention which ones are very, very common for a nativar and which ones are not. Believe it or not, some cultivars are seed produced. And so if you look at a strain is a type of a plant or a cultivar or a nativar that is propagated from seed. There are lots and lots of them. It's not the most common way that a nativar is represented, but a good example of it is cave and rock switchgrass. This is a switchgrass that if you collect the seed of it and propagate it, it's going to come back ginormous every single time. It's a strain. This genetic grouping of switchgrasses is always super tall, super vigorous, and it's way too big for the average landscape. There are other strains. There's another very popular strain of redbud called the Columbus strain. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's a strain that is seed produced, that is from the most northern location in southern Wisconsin, and therefore it's getting used in northern locations in Wisconsin and Minnesota. But it's a strain, it's seed produced. And so there are a number of cultivars that are propagated that way. Probably the most common form of nativar might be a toss-up, but this is a very common way to create a cultivar, actually a seedling within one single species. And so let me move this out of the way. If you look at the array of nativars that fit this category, you're looking at hydrangea, smooth beard tongue, black-eyed Susans, aromatic asters, heuchera, some of the heucheras, Letterman's ironweed, star coreopsis, wild hydrangea, American bittersweet. All of these are, if there's a nativar of these species, they are typically a seedling. And so what does that mean? Let's take a look, for example, at Baptisia sphaerocarpa. This is Baptisia sphaerocarpa, the yellow wild indigo. It's not a hybrid. It is a seedling that was discovered near Wynne, Arkansas. It was collected by Larry Lohman a few decades ago. It was just something that was different, a variation of yellow wild indigo that was a little bit more yellow, a little bit more intensely yellow, and therefore it was very interesting and very noticeable. And so he started taking cuttings of this and propagated it, and it's taken off since. But the point is that this is a cultivar that it comes from a straight species that comes straight from the wild. There are lots of others that do the same thing, and we'll look at some more of those examples of straight species seedlings that have been discovered in wild populations or discovered in a nursery setting from seedlings that were grown from seed that was collected in the wild originally. The next category of nativars is hybrids. Now, there are lots of programs at different botanical institutions where different species are hybridized intentionally or not intentionally, and then the progeny turn out to have very different characteristics from either of the parent species. So if it's a nativar, then it's a hybrid between two native species. But there are some, I noticed that some hybrids are being kind of passed off as natives or as nativars, but their parentage is one parent from North America and one parent from Asia. And so one common mistake that I see happening in horticulture is Magnolia acuminata crossing with denudata, producing the very popular Elizabeth cultivar. It's actually a hybrid between the North American acuminata, the cucumber magnolia, and denudata, which is I think the lily flowering magnolia from parts of Asia. So that's not really, I wouldn't call that a nativar. So you kind of have to be careful, and usually the parentage is not listed on the label. Sometimes it doesn't even say that it's a hybrid. So there's a lot of information that's not presented at the point of purchase, and you may have to do some research to find out whether or not a hybrid cultivar has two North American parents, or if the parents are from different continents. Again, I'm not saying that I'm not supporting use of any of these plants. I'm just telling you, what happens. So there are a lot of genera that are being crossed between species. The species are being crossed. Baptisia is a big one. Echinacea obviously is a big one. Coreopsis, goldenrod, monarda, heuchera, amelanchier, cercis, iris, hibiscus. When they are two North American species or two Missouri species that are crossed, then they produce the nativar. Now know that that a lot of these hybrids are chance hybrids that happen in garden settings. Over the years, we've had some chance hybrids that occurred in the Whitmire Wildflower Garden. One of them was we had Tradescantia subaspera and Tradescantia ohiensis, which normally don't bloom together, but they did end up overlapping, and we've noticed a strange seedling in the garden that was very compact and very lovely blue color, and was obviously different. Spiderworts hybridize like mad, and so in this case we saw that it occurred in the garden by chance, and so we actually took care to set it aside so that we could observe it. So a lot of these are discovered in the garden by chance. And here's an example of such a program from the Chicago Botanic Garden, where they have a breeding program, and whether or not they're intentionally hybridizing baptisias or discovering seedlings, I don't know. They're probably doing a little bit of both. I mean, but there are now dozens and dozens and dozens of these indigos. And many of them are hybrids between white indigo and blue indigo and yellow indigo and blue indigo, and just lots of color variations. You just start looking in the market, and it's a very popular thing right now. One thing I notice is that as I look at these hybrid baptisias, is that there are lots of bumblebees that are all over them. So I don't know if every single one produces nectar and pollen, but I noticed that many of them do still produce nectar and pollen and are still magnets for bumblebees. Okay, so then the last the last section that I want to talk about, this is a very tiny, if not, I mean, this is just when you have a hybrid between two genera, it's pretty rare. Crataegus and Mespilus hybridize and create Crataegus mespilus, and that's pretty unusual, rare, very, very rare. There's only a couple of them really to speak of. And then also, if you look at genetic manipulation at the cellular level in a lab, that really doesn't happen for horticultural plants because there's just not enough money to do that. It's the big ag industry that has the money to do genetic manipulation in a lab setting. So this doesn't intersect in the world of horticulture and landscaping. These aren't even native plants. So, but I just wanted to point out that that is a very, it happens, but it doesn't happen in native plant horticulture or horticulture in general. Okay, so why do we use cultivars? There are lots of reasons why we're using cultivars, and I just want to outline a few of them. Here's my my kid who hates horticulture and hates plants, but here he is posing in front of a purple coneflower down in Bentonville, Arkansas. Maybe he'll come back to horticulture someday. We'll see. So plant size and shape. Plant size is a biggie. You know, there are a lot of native plants that are just not conducive to use in small gardens. Did you know that little blue stem can be 6 feet tall? I'm 5'11", and so that's maybe an inch or two taller than I am. Little blue stem has the ability to have some height to it. Now I admit that this is in a good year where there was a lot of rainfall, and they don't always get this big, but they can get fairly big. And so it leads the industry to think about varieties that are smaller. There's a huge amount of genetic variation in little blue stem, by the way. When you go out in the wild, you see little ones and big ones and blue ones and green ones and yellow ones and orange ones and red ones. It's just amazing how much variation there is. And so it's no wonder that there's so many cultivars of little blue stem out on the market. So somebody did just sort of identify a smaller one. And so landscape architects, landscape designers like to select the smaller cultivars of little blue stem. And because they're more uniform for their design, they fit into smaller spaces. Same thing is true of Taylor red cedar. So this is an eastern red cedar variation that is a female cultivar. It has berries on it. It fits into tiny spaces. It's a photograph taken at the zoo. So, you know, normal eastern red cedar can get very big and obviously wouldn't fit into a tiny space like this. But these Taylor junipers are being used quite often in special tight spaces. Another one, so marsh blazing star, which is, why am I blanking on it? Marsh blazing star anyway, it can be fairly tall in the wild. And in a garden setting, this trait species tends to get a little floppy. And so somebody has developed a cultivar that is low and compact and doesn't flop over, and that's why we have cobalt marsh blazing star. Same is true with winterberry holly and deciduous holly, by the way. They both are tall and gangly, and they're 15 feet tall and 15 feet wide at maturity, and really don't fit very well into the average small landscape. So that's another reason why the cultivars of winterberry holly are the way they are. They're compact, they're small, they're dwarf. They fit into tiny spaces in urban situations. There's another reason why hollies are predominantly available in a cultivar form, and I'll get to that shortly. So flower color, for humans, human appreciation has been kind of one of the leading forces behind why there are millions of cultivars of iris and peony and things like that. Daylilies, there's just thousands and thousands of each of those. People seem to be obsessed with them, and daffodils and tulips. And you've heard of tulip mania in Holland. They went crazy for tulips. Anyway, so flower color has a lot to do with why cultivars are made. And probably one of the most common showy plants is Annabelle hydrangea. And Annabelle was noticed because it had almost all showy petals. And they're not petals, they're bracts that subtend the flowers. So if you look at the photograph on the right, you'll notice that there are some showy bracts that are large and white, and they surround the flower cluster. In the middle of the flower cluster are the true flowers on straight species. Now we're looking at straight species on the right and Annabelle on the left. And the true flowers that have nectar and pollen are in the middle of the flower cluster on the right. And so if you look back at Annabelle on the left, you don't really see any true flowers. There are very, very few of them in there. I'm told that they exist in there, but I never see any pollinators spending time on Annabelle hydrangea. But they go for wild hydrangea because they're full of nectar and pollen. If your goal is to have wildlife visiting your garden, you won't have any success with Annabelle hydrangea. So use the straight species because it's got flowers that are true and have nectar and pollen, and they produce seed and they function naturally. And that's one of the reasons why native gardeners and gardeners who want to attract wildlife, why they go for the straight species instead of going for the cultivar Annabelle. In reality, there's way more Annabelle in production right now, and it's sometimes commercially unavailable. I'm sorry, the wild hydrangea straight species is oftentimes commercially not available, and so they get swapped out for Annabelle all the time. If you're involved with commercial projects, municipal projects, or corporate projects, watch out for this because if your goal truly is to have wildlife, you do need to go for the straight species, and there aren't enough nurseries that are producing it. Probably the biggest explosion of variation is with echinaceas, and these are all hybrids. There's so many echinaceas. Some of them look pretty bizarre. They look like ice cream scoops. They look like double decker there looks like a Polish chicken with the feathers that stick up like this. A lot of those really bizarre hybrids really don't function anymore, kind of like Annabelle hydrangea. They don't have any nectar or pollen. And so they don't function for wildlife at all. They don't produce any seeds, so the goldfinches don't have anything to eat in a purple coneflower cultivar that's so radically different. What I have noticed is that there are a lot of cultivars that look like the straight species purple coneflower. So they have the typical petal. You can see the pollen when it's in bloom. They're visited by pollinators, by butterflies and bees and all kinds of critters. So they truly are functioning for pollinators. And then they also produce seeds. And so then the goldfinches still have something to eat. There's a lot of variation. And some function for pollinators and some don't. I mean, so one thing that I wish was in existence is a database or a list of plants that maybe is populated with a citizen science project, and where people can comment on whether or not their purple coneflower cultivars has any wildlife, what the wildlife is doing, whether it flowers and produces nectar. I've got a cat that wants to come up and he's knocking my table right now. Hello, kitty. And so, so a database of cultivars would be useful. It would take a lot of work. It would take a lot of funding, and it might take university funding to see something like that happen. but I think it would be really useful. The other thing that I think would be useful for that would be, what are the parentage of these Baptisia hybrids? Where can you go to find out the background on all these different cultivars of Baptisias? Who are the parents? What's the hybridage? Is it simply a straight species like that yellow indigo I showed you, which is not a hybrid, or does it have bizarre different parents? Maybe that information is not available. Maybe it is, and it would be a huge project to create something like that. But I think that it would be necessary, from my point of view, to start to understand the differences between these cultivars, because no two cultivars are alike. One of the things that Talame's graduate student team has discovered is that purple foliage 9-barks don't have insect herbivores, or they don't have many herbivores that, those are the butterfly and moth species that lay their eggs on the leaves. The eggs hatch out into caterpillars that chew on the leaves. So these bizarre leaf forms, color forms, tend to not function for wildlife. And that is a study that was done. We need to have more studies to understand the relationships a little bit better. But again, if your goal is to have functioning plants to feed caterpillars of butterflies and moths, then these leaf color 9-barks are not going to work. They're just not going to work. So you need to go for the straight species, or something that has green leaves. Okay, another big reason why cultivars have been created is for cold hardiness. This comes into play not so much in the Midwest, in the lower Midwest, but in the upper Midwest with redbud. And if you live in northern Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, northern locations, you might know about redbud because of this strain. Now, this is a strain; it's seed produced. This strain of redbud called Columbus. And if you look at the range map for Wisconsin, you can see a green county just below the letters WIS in Wisconsin. Columbus, Wisconsin is there. It's a small town. You can see this is the town here, with that redbud growing in the town's center. And it is the most northern location for wild growing redbud. And so it has the ability to tolerate growing in those cooler conditions, those cooler climates. And so as a result, for decades, seed of the Columbus redbud has been harvested and propagated and offered in the northern nursery range for, like I said, for decades. When I was in college 34 years ago, one of my jobs at the Arboretum was to collect Columbus redbud seed pods. I collected, I don't know how many garbage bags full. It was a lot of seed collecting. It was for the horticulture trade, so that they could have hardy redbuds. Again, seed produced, not cuttings, not clonal, but seed produced. So there is some genetic variation, but all of the plants are hardier. And that was really important, having a named cultivar of redbud, because if you wanted a hardy redbud, you needed to be able to specify which one is hardy, because otherwise you might get redbuds from St. Louis, and those are not going to be as hardy. The same thing is true with our beautyberry. And beautyberry is another very popular native plant. It's a shrub that is native. If you look at this range map, It's kind of small, but if you look carefully at the southern edge of Missouri, you'll see some yellow counties. And those yellow counties are right on the Arkansas-Missouri border, where Mervyn Wallace originally collected his strain of beautyberry. That is the most northern location. It is the hardiest beautyberry. He collected it near Lake Taneycomo, or on Lake Taneycomo. I don't believe it's there anymore. I think he says that the population is gone now. But all of the progeny from that original collection from Lake Taneycomo is the hardiest. It's the hardiest variety available. And that's important, especially for commercial applications where a landscaper is specifying beautyberry for a big project, and then the contractor who's doing the installation acquires beautyberry from a southern source, brings them to St. Louis, and then they all die because they're not hardy. So hardiness comes into play, and it is a really important issue for beautyberry when it is a commercial application, because usually landscape contractors don't go to a local nursery to buy their plants. The local hardy ecotype is available from lots of nurseries in Missouri that specialize in native plants. They all, hopefully they all have come from this original collection by Missouri Wildflowers Nursery by Mervyn Wallace. I keep jokingly and maybe seriously asking for this strain to be called Taneycomo, because it needs to be available to have successful commercial projects. And here's a case where I think attaching a cultivar name to a native plant would actually get more local ecotype beautyberry out in the market. And again, this is seed produced. It's not a clone at all. It's a plant that would be produced from seed, and all of those seeds would have that hardy genetic representation. A few other reasons why cultivars are used. Uniformity is a big one. So landscape architects and designers like to have, in some cases, a uniform palette of plants, or just a uniform mass of, in this case, little blue stem down at Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, Arkansas. Having that uniformity means that all of the plants are blue in this case, or all of the plants are green, or all of the plants have a yellow fall color, or all of the plants have a red fall color. There's a number of different cultivars. I already mentioned this one. And again, just point out that uniformity is something that that designers look for, and it's something that they like to have in certain situations. That's also why we have so many varieties of switchgrass. When I see switchgrass out in the wild, I notice a vast diversity of forms. Some of them suckering heavily, some of them more clump forming, various heights, various shapes, various colors. Various ways to hold the seed heads, holding them high sometimes, or holding them tight down in the foliage. There's a lot of genetic variation. And so anybody who likes to tinker with plants will notice this, and that's how cultivars of switchgrass have come into being. There's so many of them. So designers like to have uniformity, and they pull a cultivar and use it in front of a hospital or whatnot. And so that's uniformity. We also see uniformity with, again, with Canart red cedar, in the sense that each of these cedars in this row of small trees are basically the same, creating some regularity, some linear design. By the way, all of these red cedar cultivars are female cultivars, so they come with berries. And this one was also selected because it is smaller in size than the straight species Eastern red cedar. So it's a little more useful in tight spaces. So fruit production. Fruit production is something that is of interest. Historically, fruit production is one of the reasons why we have such a horrible problem with bush honeysuckle. Bush honeysuckle was originally it was a cultivar that was selected for greater berry production. It's like that's all we need is a bush honeysuckle that can produce more berries. But that's what happened, and it was because it was quote unquote showier, and so then it was heavily produced, and we all know what's happened since then. It's the worst invasive species that we have right now, one of the worst invasive species that we have in our region. But just take a look at hollies, because what I've noticed is that when I've tried to seed produce hollies, and you can grow them from seed, no problem there. The Missouri Department of Conservation produces deciduous holly in their tree seedling offerings. So you can buy a bundle of 15 or 20 of these, and they're all seedlings. They are commercially available. That's a good source of small local ecotype, genetically variable holly. But what I've noticed when I've propagated holly is that a very small percentage of winterberry holly comes out to be female. I've noticed that as little as 10 or 15% of the seedlings are female, and then the other 70 to 80% or more are male seedlings. And again, if your goal is to have berry production, then buying seedlings might be frustrating because you'll have so many males and very few females. And so that is directly why we have so many cultivars of hollies, because berry production seems to be the number one interest for this plant in terms of human interest. Birds love to eat the berries too, and it is necessary to have a male cultivar to get good pollination and get good berry production. But you typically plant 5 female plants to every 1 male plant to get that berry production. There's another growing part of native plant horticulture that I'm super excited about, and there are some businesses that are solely focused on producing plants for food. And so Custom Foodscapes is one in St. Louis. I'm really excited about that company because they're bringing some really amazing native plants into people's backyards so that they can eat them. And so fruit production for persimmon, if you've ever processed persimmon pulp, some of the native persimmons have very little pulp and lots of seeds, and so it's a little frustrating to process the pulp. And so if your goal is to get a lot of pulp, then this is one way to do it, having a cultivar of the native persimmon that has very few seeds and a lot of pulp. And here's one called Harvest Moon, and it has just a few seeds and a lot of pulp, and you run it through a Foley food mill, and you can get a lot of pulp in a really short period of time. So this is one thing that's driving the native fruit industry. There are a lot of pawpaw cultivars as well. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit here, and I want to talk about a subject that is important, and that is, you've heard me mention local ecotype. Are there cultivars or nativars that are local in nature, local ecotypes? Yes, there are. I'm not saying with this slide that that the Grow Native program supports nativars, or their point of purchases, which you can find at garden centers all across the state. All of these in these pictures are straight species native plants. But what I am saying here is that when you have a local ecotype native plant, it is adapted in so many ways. And when you have a non-local ecotype plant, it's not adapted. It doesn't have those adaptations to climate. It doesn't have those adaptations to the local fauna. So the local insects recognize our local ecotype straight species plants. And in general, they get confused when they see a non-local ecotype nativar, because they have not evolved together. And evolution is something that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. And there are very, very specific relationships between our plants in our region and the insects, and then also the birds that eat the insects in our region. It's a very intricate network, food network that is has been developed over millions of years. And so that's why non-local ecotype plants can sometimes not function for us as gardeners. If our goal is to have and encourage wildlife in our landscapes. All right, let's look at a couple examples. If you look at bur oak, you'll see that there's a lot of variation. Remember I said there's a lot of variation of switchgrass and little blue stem in the wild. There's a lot of variation in the wild of bur oak. And in the upper left corner, you see tiny acorns that are probably the size of a, between about the size of a quarter. And these are small acorns compared to what we find in Missouri. On the lower right are Missouri bur oak acorns, and they're huge. And so what's going on here? If you go north in the northern range of bur oak or in the northeastern range, that's where you find these tiny acorns. And if you look in the southern range, you'll find these large acorns. Those are the ones that we have in Missouri. Also, if you notice where they grow in the wild, our Missouri bur oaks are floodplain species. They always are associated with alluvial soils along creeks and rivers. And if you look at the bur oak from northern parts in the Northeast, they're always growing on ridge tops, and they're always growing in places that are extremely dry and well drained. So what's going on? Scientists has looked at these plants genetically and found out that our bur oak in Missouri tends to hybridize with swamp white oak. So it has a lot of swamp white oak genes in it, and therefore it tolerates flooded conditions. In bur oak in other parts of the country they have white oak genes, so they're hybridizing with white oaks in nature. And so those white oak hybrids cannot tolerate floodplains, and they grow on ridge tops. They're very different plants. If we were to buy a northern bur oak and plant it in Missouri in a floodplain, it would die. It would not be tolerant of being underwater for weeks on end, which is what happens along the Merrimack River and some of our bigger rivers. And so local ecotype matters. Same is true for beautyberry, and I mentioned this already. Local ecotype really matters. And I've been involved with too many commercial projects where beautyberry was specified and it came in from out of our region and it died within the first year. Not winter hardy. Local ecotype matters. Henry Eiler's sweet coneflower comes from Montgomery County, Illinois, which is just over the Mississippi River from St. Louis and a little bit to the north. This sweet coneflower cultivar is a local ecotype. It performs great. Performs for wildlife, it performs for gardeners. It's a plant that is tried and true and very successful. But do most people know that? I don't know. If we had a database that told people that this is an ecotype that is derived from Montgomery County, Illinois, and that it was a chance seedling that was discovered by Henry Eiler's then there would be more information available for you to make your decisions. And I mentioned screaming yellow indigo, yellow wild indigo. Again, this is a chance seedling that occurred in nature, growing on a glade. I think I said Wynne, Arkansas, but I think it's from Searcy County, Arkansas, actually. Local ecotype. And believe it or not, Annabelle hydrangea is a local ecotype wild hydrangea. Now, this might be news to some people, but Annabelle hydrangea comes from Anna, Illinois. And the original nursery row where this plant was discovered had hundreds of seedlings of wild hydrangea growing in the nursery row that were derived from seed that was locally collected. And this is local ecotype hydrangea. They were propagated and grown out in a nursery setting. And then when these plants grew up and got bigger, lo and behold, somebody discovered Annabelle hydrangea, which has all of these showy bracts. So it's a local ecotype. Our herbivore is going to recognize it? Probably. Our pollinator is going to recognize it? Probably not, because it doesn't have any or doesn't have much nectar and pollen. Boy, I'm just throwing information out. There's a lot of good information to have. Again, if we had a database to put it in, it'd be really nice. These are all seedlings of copper iris. They're not hybrids. They're not nativars. Actually, the one in the middle is a nativar called Lois is yellow, but it's from Memphis. And see, Memphis is not very far away from St. Louis. But there's a lot of color variation. One thing that I would like to encourage is for us to celebrate that color variation, to encourage all of that color variation in a garden. There's so many different genetic variations, and what better thing to do than to have them represented in our landscapes. Same is true of Hibiscus moschutus. These are all color variations that exist in the same wetland in south central Illinois. These are all wild seedlings. They are all propagated from seed, so they have this variation naturally. And what a wonderful thing in a garden setting to have all of this variation growing together in a single garden. Same is true of rose turtlehead. These are all seedlings of rose turtlehead that were derived from the wild rose turtlehead population east of Kirksville, Missouri. There's all this variation. There's white ones and purple ones and rose pink ones and lavender ones and some tall ones and some short ones, and every leaf texture and variation that you can imagine. Why not celebrate all of them? They can be seed produced, and they can you can have different all this variation growing in a garden. And then also the same is true for little blue stem, as I mentioned before. If you grow wild seedlings, straight species, little blue stem, you end up with green ones and yellow ones and blue ones. And I think that variation is attractive. I think that it's you know, I'm not really a big fan of uniformity. I think that these colors play off of each other in a very pleasing and beautiful way. And you have greater genetic variation in our landscape. Now, I want to mention just a couple examples of why cultivars can be problematic. So the echinacea is all hybridized, and this is yellow coneflower, Echinacea paradoxa, and you can see that it has a limited range in south central Missouri. I don't know of any places where yellow coneflower overlaps on the same glade with glade coneflower, which is this plant. And glade coneflower has a much broader range. This is Echinacea simulata, but you can see that in south central Missouri, they might overlap somewhat. But what happens is when a gardener brings, for example, yellow coneflower into their landscape, and their yard happens to be, or their property happens to be near a wild glade, bees can carry the pollen from the garden out into the wild glade. And then the next thing you know, you start seeing seedlings that look like this. And this is what has happened at Shaw Nature Reserve. Echinacea simulata was crossed using bees, not using bees, just bees did it naturally, crossed with the local glade coneflower. So yellow coneflower and glade coneflower, and then these populations are starting to show up out in nature, out on the glades, and this is a potential problem. Glade coneflower is common enough that I don't think that anybody's really raising any red flags. But the plant that is not so common is Echinacea tennesseeensis. The Tennessee coneflower is on the endangered species list, and or at least it used to be on the endangered species list. I don't know if it is anymore, but gardeners would bring purple coneflower into their homes because purple coneflower is, probably the most common native plant. And if you lived next to a wild glade in the southeastern U.S., these Tennessee coneflower populations were starting to change and to be compromised, and there was all this color variation. And so scientists were getting really concerned because this is a very rare species, and the thought that that some garden variety purple coneflower is causing this change in nature is really disconcerting. It's a serious problem. And there are, by the way, a lot of cultivars of Tennessee coneflower that are available commercially now. So let me wrap up by just saying a few things. I mentioned earlier that that these weird cultivars of purple coneflower don't function for wildlife the same way that straight species and cultivars that look like the straight species. And you can see pollinators on coneflowers that have pollen and nectar. Same is true of wild hydrangea. I mentioned this already. The thing that is not known, so we see pollinators and how they interact with cultivars, and that's somewhat known. But the thing that's less known is whether or not our local insect caterpillars will feed on cultivars of native plants or nativars. Will zebra swallowtails lay their eggs on a cultivar of pawpaw, a cultivar that comes from, say, Pennsylvania or something like that? Don't know. Will giant swallowtails lay their eggs on wafer ash? Well, no, wafer ash is not a great example because I don't think there's any cultivars of wafer ash. Will pipevine caterpillars or pipevine butterflies lay their eggs on cultivars of pipevine? I don't know. There's this question that's out there, and we really don't know the answers to it. And there's not enough research to give us those answers. Unfortunately, there's not enough money in the world to support these kinds of research projects. But there is, for sure, this research that came from the Talamy team that has definitively shown that these leaf variations do not encourage herbivory on ninebark. And so if this is true, then what else is true out there of insect herbivory? Herbivory is a very specific and different thing than pollination, and it's something that takes a little more careful look to determine. You can see bumblebees flying around on cultivars, and that, so pollination is easy to see. Making observations on herbivory is a slightly different thing. So I'm going to wrap it up here. That is my presentation on cultivars and nativars. Are they too much of a good thing? I don't know. I pose that question to you, and I'll let you decide. I hope that you learned something new, and I am continuing to learn new things about nativars and cultivars and straight species, and I think that we have a long way to go. Let's open it up for questions.
Excellent, Scott. That was very informative. Thank you. And we have some terrific questions in the Q&A section. I want to remind our audience that if you have some questions, please pop them into Q&A because that's where I'll be focusing for content. So one question from Pamela is, how do we know if the hybrids support wildlife as natives do? The ones that do seem to produce pollen and seed.
Well, I tried to indicate that that you can see pollinators flying on the flowers just as a casual observer in a garden. You can see the pollinators. You have to hunt for the caterpillars that may be appearing or may not be appearing. It takes a little bit more effort to look for eggs that are being laid on your plants, or the caterpillars that may be hiding in the foliage. But we need to be insect sleuths or plant sleuths, and really start paying attention to our plants to really start to understand what kind of relationships are happening.
So a related question is, I guess, the nutritional content, right, of a cultivar. We all know that honeysuckle is immensely popular. It's not especially nutritious, but I suppose that's a big research, big D1 academic school research question, probably, right?
Yeah, definitely. The average person isn't going to know how to do chemical analysis on berries. Yul Gibbons did. He was a chemist, by the way. He said that that there's the vitamin C content of a half a cup of chopped violet leaves equals the vitamin C content of 5 oranges. Anyway, who's a chemist that can figure that out? Yul Gibbons. Is he still alive?
Awesome.
I don't think so.
That is awesome. All right, rethinking my nutritional palate now. Thank you. Okay, so one question from Val is, I thought the definition of a species when I was in school included the non-interbreeding requirement. So are these really distinct species?
Boy, well, if you look at plants in the world, they are hybridizing, and they have always been hybridizing in the wild. And that's how speciation happens. If you've ever looked at maybe I'm not answering this question right, but I do like to think of this. If you've ever looked at a botanical text like Steinmark's Flora of Missouri and wonder why it starts with the ferns and the fern allies, and it ends with orchids in the back, in the aster family in the back. It's basically a history of evolution. The very oldest plants on our planet, the ones that have been around for tens or hundreds of millions of years, are in the front of the botanical text. There's very few species left of most of those. Magnolias in the front of the book. There's only a few species of magnolias, but if you look at the aster family in the back of the book, there's hundreds and hundreds of them. There's so many goldenrods and so many asters, and there's so many oaks and so many hybrids between them as well. So if you look at the evolutionary history, plants that are in their heyday, plants that are new evolutionarily speaking, have lots of species variation and lots of hybridization going on. And the very ancient plants on our planet are so old that they're not hybridizing. There's not as much genetic variation around anymore. And so there's just not a whole lot of species variation. But anyway, there's hybrids in the wild. There's hybrids in gardens. There's people creating hybrids. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm just saying that there's hybrids everywhere.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize magnolia was such an old species. I always think of ginkgos. It reminds me of an NPR article. I don't even know why they were talking about all historically, like ancient times, Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, there were apparently several subspecies, and yet we're the only ones to have seemed to have survived that, unless, you're looking for Bigfoot out in the mountains.
That's because we're the strongest of our species.
Right.
And the meanest.
Sadly, but sometimes true. Okay, so Nicole asks, is there any concern about nativars escaping gardens and interfering with wild populations? You talked about that a little bit, but what about in non-fragile, possibly, ecosystems? For instance, my backyard or side yard, is there a time and place consideration when it comes to planting some of these species?
Sure. I showed you two examples of Echinacea tennesseeensis and Echinacea paradoxa, where those genes have bled into wild populations. The majority of people live in urban centers, and it's the people that are sort of out at the outskirts of those urban centers that maybe have a glade next door, or maybe they have a rich ancient remnant woodland in their backyard, or maybe they live next to a park or a nature conservancy property or something like that. If you live in one of those sensitive areas, then you automatically should think carefully about what you put in your landscape. But there really is no place to there's no clearinghouse of information to know what species can be or are problematic. And so therefore you either just don't touch anything, or if you're lucky enough to listen to this presentation, maybe you've gained a little more knowledge, and you can make some informed decisions about what kind of plants that you put in your garden.
So Patrice asks, what is the best way for people to find native plants that are from their ecoregion?
Well, a great way to find local ecotype native plants in our area is to look for the Grow Native point of purchase. And so you can go into a garden center and you can see, I oftentimes have the Grow Native plants in one location. Look for the Grow Native logo. There might be a big banner or a sign, or look for the Grow Native plant tags that are in the pots. That's probably the easiest way to do it. I also like to get to know my nursery people, and I ask them questions. And I like to say, hey, well, where did your plants come from? And if they know where their plants came from, if they know they're a local ecotype, they'll probably tell you. We get them from a local source that gets them from seed that was collected locally. If they really don't know where the plants come from, I bet you if you go to a box store and ask them where their plants come from, they'll go, they come from a truck. What are you talking about?
Absolutely.
Then they don't know where the plants come from, then they're not a local.
That's fair. We had a roundtable discussion at the 2022 Planet Native, and Merv Wallace with Missouri Wildflowers was talking about literally going out in the fields, hand sourcing, and he only collects seeds from the state of Missouri. And to your point, that's one of the ways you can tell where are they getting their seed.
Yeah, and that's a rare thing nowadays. It's hard to survive when you have a dedicated person to seed collecting. There are other companies that do spend a lot of time seed collecting, and those are the best ones, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So we have a question that says, can you give our audience some tips on how to tell what a true native is versus a cultivar?
How do you do that? Well, you have to rely on the information that's on the plant tag that you're given. And so you have to rely on the integrity of the nursery that you're buying the plants from. You must know that if you're buying something from a box store, who knows where that, a lot of that plant material is produced in, believe it or not, in Asia and shipped to North America. And So anyway, I'm not trying to diss box stores. I'm just trying to answer your question. I think that it goes back to the earlier question. Looking for the grow native tag, I think, is a tried and true way to get good plant material. If you are a grow native member nursery, you abide by a set of guidelines that say that you're producing native straight species, local ecotype plants. And it doesn't mean that you, as a nursery person, can't also grow and sell nativars and cultivars as well. But it says that if you have the Grow Native logo and the Grow Native tag, then those plants are a local ecotype and a good source of plants. Stasia's muted herself.
I did. I'm so sorry. My neighbor's dog was losing it outside my window. So thank you. So I have one more question. Thanks for the heads up, Scott. And then a shout out that I would like to share as well. Val asks, won't cultivars planted with natives of the same species eventually peter out with cross-pollination?
Oh, that's interesting. It depends because, boy, if I go back to Genetics 101 at the University of Wisconsin, you realize that there's so many different types of gene crossing, and there's so many different ways that genes cross, and every one of them is a different mechanism, and so anyway, who knows who's going to come out on top? Some genetic strains are stable, and some genetic strains are not stable. And like I said, every single plant is different. There's no two that are alike, and they have a different gene path. Some plants are more stable than others. So it really comes down to information that you won't be able to find unless you're a geneticist, and even then you probably won't be able to find it unless you do the research yourself. If you're tinkering with plants and you start to notice that that your cultivar of whatever is starting to disappear, then you probably have an unstable hybrid. Some of them are never going to go away. I see plants in people's yards, old historic plants that have been planted maybe hundreds of years ago, and they're surviving in old farm grounds. Old cultivars of peonies, they're totally stable. They're not producing any seed, though. Probably that has something to do with it.
Interesting. Yeah, when you were talking about the holly, that like a significant portion of the saplings were male dominant. Sarah and I had a text exchange in the background trying to figure out like, how does that work mathematically? But to your point, everything does everything a little different. All species, I suppose, of plants.
Yeah, every single species is different. And boy, the winterberry hollies are a pain in the neck growing them from seed. Or in my experience anyway, they are, because we collected our seed originally from St. Genevieve County, which is southeastern Missouri along the Mississippi River, kind of. And that population of winterberry holly did that. Like, maybe it's not happening in the same way in other populations of winterberry holly. Winterberry holly is native across the entire eastern United States.
Interesting, fascinating things. So the shout out I would like to share is from Chris Cardwell. He wants to shout out to KC Wildlands seed team volunteers and their staff for the work in collecting seeds in remnant prairies across the Kansas City metro. And those seeds are then shared with other public spaces to help keep the genetic variation going and being local ecotype. So they do a lot of great work.
Terrific.
All right, so so I think we've pretty well closed out our questions. Scott, any closing thoughts before we end for the day?
Sure. I would love for you to find ways to make observations in your gardens. Pay attention to what is happening. If you have nativars in your garden, take a look at them. Look at them carefully. Make a note of what insect activity may or may not be happening. And then maybe you can find a way to get involved with a local organization, the Deep Roots organization, the Wild Ones organization, and bring up your observations with your fellow gardeners. There's not enough information out there. We don't know, we've only scratched the surface of what we know. And so I encourage you to be observant gardeners, spend more time in the garden. It's a great opportunity to be outside and get excited about nature anyway. For those of you who think that all nativars are fantastic, or for those of you who think that all nativars are evil, I think that you need to just sort of look more carefully at all of the cultivars, each one individually, before you cast judgment on them as a whole. And thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation.
We really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation that pitched this last fall. I've been looking forward to it ever since. And from the attendance this afternoon, I'm not the only one. So thank you very much, Scott. This was terrific. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And it's a beautiful day. Enjoy it. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.